All right. Well, 6:42. So uh, tonight, guys, we are just here to listen to a story, and it's a real important story. It's one that everybody needs to hear, and it's one that everybody needs to try to share also. And it would be mighty hypocritical of us not to use the little platform that we have to try to share this story, especially because it's about a young man who was raised right here in Harnett County. He was a Trojan. They went to Harnett Central High School. He was only 23 years old. He was a father, a son, a brother, a veteran, my worthy opponent in high school and middle school athletics, and he was a child of God. So, young Democrats and everyone that ever watched this, will you please join me and give your most undivided attention to this young man's mother. And one of the strongest women I know is Dolly Griggs.
Thank you, Tyler, and thank you, young Democrats of Harnett County, just for giving us this opportunity to share our son's story on this platform. I will share, and then my husband Anthony will share after me. I also will be looking down at my notes occasionally, just sharing, just so that, because this is very emotional and sometimes I'll forget my thoughts. But one of the statements I'm going to say before we get started is understanding American racism and the racism in Harnett County means understanding Emmett Till and Ahmaud Arbery's story, and also Christian Griggs' story. And there's so many others that we don't even know of. Christian's story is not a police shooting, but where the police conspired and covered up a murder. Christian's story, on October the 12th, 2013, our son Christian was gunned down by his father-in-law on his front porch. I lost my oldest son and my only son. Christian went there to pick up his daughter as he planned for months. Christian called his father, stating that his father-in-law was using profanity, using the F word at him. My husband told Christian, "I'm on the way." And upon arrival, about 5 minutes later, 3 miles down the road, he found Christian lying face down on his father-in-law's front porch, shot 6 times. Christian was a remarkable son, a North Carolina State student, a patriot, a combat veteran who served our country honorably and heroically in Iraq. He survived war just to come home and be gunned down on his father-in-law's front porch for being a father to his daughter. Christian was shot 6 times, once in the shoulder, once in the stomach, and when he was incapacitated, Reverend Pat Chisenhall stood over him and shot him, his Black son-in-law, 4 times in the back when he was lying face down. He pulled the trigger 4 times in his lower back. And I'd like to share his autopsy with you so that you can get the visual of what we're talking about. Is there a way? Let's see. Are you able to see his autopsy? So Christian was shot in his shoulder, in his stomach, and according to the medical examiner, when Christian was almost on the ground or lying on his stomach, he was shot 4 more times. And if you look at these shot patterns, you can see that there's no way anyone could be moving to get those angles and that close of a shooting. But he shot him 4 times, stood there and pulled the trigger 4 times in his back. And D.A. Stewart will go down in history for one of the most horrific injustices in Harnett County, North Carolina. Pat Chisenhall fabricated a story, and the DA and the Sheriff Department bought it. There was no break-ins, no threats, no restraining orders, but they knew this. DA Stewart chose to turn a blind eye to justice and allow a white pastor to murder an unarmed Black man and give a false narrative. The medical examiner called Christian death a homicide, but the Harnett County Sheriff Department called Pat Chisenhall the victim on the incident report and called Christian Hand the weapon. My husband was the first on the scene because Christian had called him. I arrived shortly afterwards. And I looked around at the scene trying to understand why this man shot my son. I observed closed blinds, no broken glass anywhere, patio furniture on the porch. One of the deputies informed us they were taking Christian to Wake Med. We followed the vehicle to Wake Med, and the Harnett County Sheriff Department was still on the scene and the area marked off with the yellow tape when we left the scene. In pursuit of our civil trial, we obtained the DA and the Sheriff Department file in which we had a fight to get all the way to the appellate court. The picture of the crime scene looked nothing like what we witnessed on the day of the shooting. On the day of the shooting, like I said, there was nothing, no broken glass, the blinds were closed. But once we got the pictures from the Sheriff Department, it was significantly different than what we saw. During the trial, the CSI investigator testified he found no fingerprints on Christian or any portion of the house. There was no bullet holes anywhere in the blinds, in the sidings or windows. 3 shell casings found neatly behind a chair, and the other three casings couldn't be located. Pat Chisenhall stated he fired his shots from inside his home behind a sofa across the room into the window. Pat Chisenhall called to report the shooting. Unknowingly, Christian X was on the phone with 911 also. She was on the phone at the same time. Chisenhall said he was shooting Christian. And on the 911 call, you don't hear anything. No threats, no gunshots, no glass breaking. Harnett County corruption has become the norm. Go ask anyone in the surrounding counties. No one is above the law. We're trapped, and the citizens of Harnett County in a systemic racist justice system without an avenue to be heard or to obtain justice. We have asked Josh Stein to intervene. He can at any point intervene and investigate Christian's murder. We want him to intervene to investigate the murder and the corruption and the obstruction of justice by the law enforcement in regards to Christian case. Pat Chisenhall should be in jail instead of pastoring at his church, being with his family, and sleeping in his bed at night. He took a life and went home. The 12 jurors in the civil suits, forensic experts who reviewed the case file, and the private investigators all came to the same conclusion. There's no way the shooting occurred as Pat Chisenhall said it did. This should not be Christian's story. My husband also going to share some of the things that he's going to share will probably be some of the duplications of what I talked about, but our information is a little bit more different. So I'll give my husband a chance to share.
Good evening, young Democrats, and thank you for a chance to speak on your platform. We appreciate the chance to highlight Christian on this day and to be able to share with you what we experienced on that day. The 12th of October, 2013 was the worst day of my life, and it continues to haunt me to this day. From this day forward, I'll forever be the father of a murdered son. Unlike the murderer, Pat Chisenhall, who claimed PTSD, he can't remember. That's the farthest from the truth. PTSD is the inability to forget those traumatic experiences, such as finding your son laying face down on his father-in-law's front porch. There is no statute of limitation for murder. 3 things I want to talk about is malfeasance, incompetence, and corruption. The Harnett County Sheriff Office in the very beginning was in cover-up mode. Not only did they refuse to bring criminal charges, but they made themselves third-party interveners in our civil lawsuit. They went forth from there to defend a murderer, and they used Harnett County revenue and resources to attempt to thwart our every effort to get after the truth, to the point in which we had to go to the North Carolina Appellate Court twice to compel them to release the investigative file. However, even in fighting to get that file, when we got to court, we found that that file was not the same file, in fact, we fought for. Once we got the trial, there were many things that occurred during that trial in which the Harnett County Sheriff Department and the Harnett County DA worked side by side with the defense of Pat Chisenhall. We are the first family in the history in the state of North Carolina to defend and defeat the North Carolina Castle Doctrine. If Christian had been killed in self-defense and the Castle Doctrine had been applied, he would have been immune, that being Pat Chisenhall, from civil lawsuit. He was not immune from civil lawsuit, as we sued for a wrongful death suit and we won. Sheriff Coates states during his tenure, it did not happen during his tenure. What does he consider to be his tenure? He's been a law enforcement officer for over 2 decades, sworn to defend, an oath to serve and to protect. So when was this break in his tenure or his oath? And how often does that occur? Was it Brandon Bethea, John Livingston, Christian Griggs? But I'm willing to bet you and tell you that's probably more often than that, and it's at its own discretion. The previous DA, Vernon Stewart, by way of the county attorney, Monica Jackson, stated in court that he would never prosecute this case, not even having seen the evidence. And I stated he won't always be DA. And to this day, he is not DA. The same county attorney, Monica Jackson, was admonished during our trial by the judge for attempting to lead Harnett County employees on the stand in their testimony. This same county attorney, Monica Jackson, went before the county commissioners during one of our hearings and convinced all the county commissioners to come and sit behind the sheriff in court. I don't know if you understand the impact of having all the county commissioners sitting behind the sheriff in front of a local judge and what that does and how it biases the courtroom. There was only one county commissioner, whom I won't name, that did not stand with the rest of the Harnett County commissioners. We had a trial. There was a judge appointed. There was a jury impaneled. Understand, it takes days to impanel a jury, and all these things we had to endure. That jury heard testimony for over a week and saw evidence. And they were charged by that judge, and they deliberated for 93 minutes, and they returned a unanimous verdict that Christian was not killed in self-defense. If a homicide is the death of one at the hands of another individual, and that is found to be not in self-defense, then it's murder. There is no statute of limitation on murder. And on that day, the sheriff and the district attorney allowed a murderer to get up out of the courtroom and walk out. That goes to show you that justice is only as fair and just as those we entrust to enforce and enact it. Talking a little bit about incompetence in the Harnett County Sheriff Department. On the day of the incident on October 12, 2013, they established a crime scene, and they established a crime scene log. In that crime scene log, Pat Chisenhall Jr. entered the active crime scene twice. Once he claimed to go in and to retrieve medications for his father. Later, under oath, his father testified that he did not require any medication. The second time he entered on the crime log, that he went in to secure a dog, the pet. However, under oath, determined the dog was in a cage in a pen already secured in the yard. Under oath, during testimony and discovery, Pat Chisenhall Jr. found out that he entered the home a third time, in which he confessed he jumped the rear fence and entered the home from the rear. When Harnett County Sheriff deputies were asked under oath, on the stand, under testimony, what would be the penalty for an individual who did such an act, they stated the fact that that individual would be arrested, but he was not. As my wife said, the crime scene was altered. There's no probability that this shooting could have occurred as it was alleged. The shooter's defense is that he does not remember, but yet he claimed castle doctrine and self-defense. Someone went into that home, retrieved a rifle, came out onto the front porch, and murdered Christian. Christian was shot 6 times, once in the left shoulder, once in the lower right abdomen, and 4 times in the back while laying face down. Tonight, I asked you, as you lay comfortably in your bed, take a breath, roll over onto your stomach, and think, what is it that you could do lying in that position that would impose someone to shoot you 4 times in your back? What possible threat could you have to an individual standing over you with a rifle who's already shot you twice? Could you do to that person to pose a threat to cause them to want to shoot you 4 more times in your back? All these shots were alleged to be fired from inside the living room of Pat Chisenhall's home, from behind a sofa, through a window. And all 6 shots, not one striking glass, blind, curtain, wall, all 6 shots hit nothing but Christian. And the 4 shots in his back transcend down at an angle of 22 degrees. There's no way possible an individual standing could shoot Christian down at 22 degrees unless he's on the ground or laying parallel with the ground. The sheriff, even though knowing that Christian was shot 6 times, there was only 3 shell cases recovered from the crime scene in a neat little pile underneath a chair. During testimony during the trial, sheriff deputies testified that they had seen shell cases in other locations that were not accounted for or in the file. The crime scene was handed over to the Chisenhall family within hours after the shooting. The case was closed in 24 hours. One of the officers on the scene reported that Christian's death was a homicide, but Pat Chisenhall and his daughter were the victims. They came into this with such a biased and one-way opinion that Christian couldn't even be the victim in his own homicide. Never does the victim of a homicide survive. That's why it's called a homicide. That is the sheer incompetence and the corruption in which we're dealing with the Harnett County Sheriff Department. And I'll tell you this, the truth doesn't change. I haven't seen my granddaughter since that day. Someday she'll marry and she'll have children. And those will be my great-grandchildren. That is the truth, because that's my DNA, and the truth does not change. Truth is parallel with justice. You can't have justice without truth. Anyone willing to take the position of Harnett County Sheriff or District Attorney in Harnett County, knowing these transgressions and these egregious things have happened, and willing to look the other way, can't be about justice. Young Democrats, I thank you for your time and your support. God bless.
And there are some other things that I like to just cover that went on in the trial for a moment, since we're talking about some of the highlights in the trial that was like just unbelievable. One of the things that happened is that one of the deputies, that in his deposition, he stated that that when he walked into the home, the shell casings was right there in the doorway. But on the pictures, it showed the shell casings behind a chair in a neat little pile. The other thing, what's her name, Monica Jackson, the Harnett County attorney, just how she sat with the Chisenhall family and how their attorney and her, the Harnett County attorney and the sheriff department, how they always there supporting them, guiding them the whole time, as if they were their attorneys. I just cannot believe the racism and the systemic injustice that happened with our son case, and that this man is still alive. I mean, this man is still at his home. He gets to go home every night, eat with his family, see his family, preach at his church. And I heard some people say, well, Pat Chisenhall is a good man. He's a good man. This man stood over my son's body and shot him 4 times in the back.
You know, one additional things, you're talking about the trial in Harnett County and how they intervened and took part with the murderer to support the murderer, and they used Harnett County's resources to do so. You know, there was a detective during the trial that was responsible for the forensics. Monica Jackson, during a recess, after this detective had given his testimony, during a recess, got with this detective, asked him to go to the Harnett County Sheriff Department, retrieve a magnifying glass, come back to court, where they called him back to the stand and asked him to do some analysis and forensics on some of Christian's clothing and evidence in front of the jury. They had this stuff in their possession for over a year and did nothing with it. But because things in the trial were not going as they presumed it would, they decided to try to pull a last-ditch effort to have this guy do analysis on the stand in front of the jury by direction of Monica Jackson. And when he was asked who directed him to go get this magnifying glass, he testified under oath that, in fact, it was the county attorney, Monica Jackson.
And there was also a deputy that testified that, based on the crime scene, that there is no way that the shooting could have happened the way that they said it did. But yet, Pat Chisenhall is still a free man. But thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you for giving us this platform. I pray that all that are listening, that they will share our son's story. I pray that justice will come soon, and that the deputies, and this is another thing, those deputies are still on the sheriff department. They're still working at the sheriff department. They're still there. How many other families? Now, we were on the scene. We saw the scene, what happened, and they still altered the scene. How many other families have been wrongfully, that their child or is in jail because the deputies decided they wanted to allow one of their friends or someone they know not to go to jail and frame someone else? Basically, our son is that this sheriff department knew this family, had a relationship with this family, and they came there that day and saw my Black son lying there on the front porch. And he's married to a white lady, a white girl. And this family who's known in the community, they felt that my son didn't deserve justice. And they covered it up for them, gave them a story, helped alter the crime scene. And here we are.
There's a loophole in the law. The sheriff or the district attorney have to call for the investigation or a special prosecutor in order to prosecute the case. They have what they call prosecutorial discretion. And that's kind of what I was talking about with the sheriff earlier. They have the authority to look left or right or the other way at any time in which they choose to do so. And no one can come in and investigate them unless they invite someone to do it. If they're in conspiracy with one another to violate the law, then the way they've gotten around this is by simply not investigating and not by charging.
But I guarantee you that if they came in to investigate Christian's case, the SBI, the FBI, if they came in and got Christian's case filed, they'll come to the same conclusion. Because we, as I said before, we have forensics, a forensic team out of Florida They were the same team that did Jordan Davis autopsy from the Loud Music murderer. And they told us, they said that the way that we operate on the truth. We may not tell you what you want to hear. And I told them, I want the truth. Whatever you come back with, that's what we just have to accept. And so they took our son's case file and they reviewed it. And they came back and said, there's no way that that shooting happened the way that Pat Chisenhall said it did. He said, your son was shot on that front porch. Someone came out of that home and shot Christian. But the sheriff department, the sheriff knows this, the DA knows this, but they both refused to bring charges against his family. And I asked that we just be with us, that we have to make Christian's case forefront so that this doesn't happen to another family in this county. But thank you so much for allowing us to share.
Thank y'all for coming, really. And before we go, first I'd like to encourage everybody to continue to share this and to pass it along. And I'd also like to point out two things before we leave, like what this tells us and what we can do about it. What I think what's really important about this story is what Miss Dolly said in the very beginning, is that Christian's murder is not like a George Floyd or Alton Sterling or Breonna Taylor, and he was not murdered by the police. His murder was covered up by the police, like Ahmaud Arbery or our neighbor down here in Bladenboro by the name of Lennon Lacey was straight lynched in 2014, ruled a suicide. But what that tells us is that you don't have to just be a white cop that can get away with murdering a black man today in America. You can be a white pastor, you can be a white person and get away with it. And I love my country. There's a lot of things that I'm not proud of, and that is certainly one of them. And lastly, before we leave, I have to say this: there's nothing that anybody can do to ever bring Christian back, but there is some things that we can do, and there is some things that we will do, or at least as long as I have any kind of influence over this little party right here, the Young Democrats of Harnett County. We will always support candidates for district attorney, and we will support candidates for sheriff to make justice for Christian Griggs a big part of their platform, an unapologetic part of their platform. And if they don't, well, then they won't see any support from the YDHC. That's on my mama, and I can't. Thank everybody for coming out. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Dolly. And if there's anything that we could do, just please let us know.
Thank you. Thank you for tonight.
Thank everybody.